Okay, so thank you all very much for coming, and it's really wonderful to be here. So the question I asked myself when I was looking at what this event was about, and I wanted to tie in some element of LGBTQ plus history into this as well, but the question I wanted to ask myself is, why do people spy? I mean, if we think about it just for even a moment, this is an extremely dangerous thing for someone to do. Perhaps, for example, in the Second World War, if you were a German individual, to be parachuted behind enemy lines into Britain itself and to be expected to relay information back to Germany. And it was particularly dangerous for them because most of them were all rounded up very quickly. But then what about homegrown traitors? What about people, for example, who are willing to betray their own nation to provide information to another nation or another cause? We can also think about this in terms, for example, corporate espionage, people who are willing to betray the people who've employed them. And if you think about it even for a moment, it's extremely dangerous because what happens if you get caught? The chances are you're going to end up in prison, or in the case, for example, of the American traitors, Ethel Rosenberg, for example, she ends up actually being executed along with her husband Julius for their role in spying against the American state for the Soviet Union. So we're talking about really dire consequences if it all goes wrong. So what kind of person then do we imagine wishes to do this? What kind of things would lead a person to this kind of decision-making process, to this kind of life? And so I want to talk particularly about the reasons why people might do this. Okay, so I'm also going to talk in particular obviously about John Cairncross, who I wrote my previous book about, but also the Cambridge Five more generally, because they're a particularly interesting group who operated in the 1930s through to the early 1950s, so a very different time period from today. So one of the things which happens, particularly when we get into, for example, the 1980s, is that a lot of espionage is actually quite financially driven. People are doing it for the money. However, there's an idea, certainly within the historiography, that is the history of history itself, what has been written about the past, that a lot of this is actually about ideology. And we'll go through some of the ways that people have thought about this in the past. But first, before we do that, who are the Cambridge Five? So we have this individual here, who is Anthony Blunt, or as he was towards the end of his life, Sir Anthony Blunt, before he had his knighthood stripped of him. So he was a modern language scholar at the University of Cambridge, having initially gone to Cambridge to study maths, but then he ends up switching over to languages. And then he goes on in his later life to become an extremely eminent art historian. So he was the surveyor of the Queen's pictures and basically travelled in highly aristocratic circles. So he didn't come from the aristocracy himself, he was the son of a clergyman, but he still came from that kind of upper middle class society that Britain cultivated in the 19th and 20th centuries. And so how did he have access to secret information? Well, during the Second World War, he worked for MI5, so that's the security service. So who's the next person we could talk about? So this is a man called Guy Burgess. And Guy Burgess is, again, another fairly upper middle class individual. His father was a naval officer, and he was educated, among other places, at Eton College, obviously an extremely prestigious public school in the United Kingdom. And he actually had a brief sojourn himself into the world of intelligence, beyond working for the Soviet Union, working very briefly for MI6, that's the Secret Intelligence Service, which does foreign intelligence for the United Kingdom. But then he went on to forge a career in other places as well, such as the BBC, but more important from our point of view, with the Foreign Office. Okay, so then the next person we have is Donald Maclean, who was actually the son of his, obviously his father, but his father was Sir Donald Maclean, who was a Liberal MP. So again, an upper middle class individual, and Donald went off to forge a lifelong career until the 1950s, again working for the Foreign Office. And then we have Kim Philby, perhaps the arch nemesis of the British Security Service, MI5, for a long time. Have any of you actually read, for example, John le Carré's Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy? Anyone put their hand up for me? Yes. So he is basically the ghost who haunts Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, one of the most damaging spies to have ever betrayed the British state. And he worked for MI6, and he was in fact in charge of Soviet counterintelligence for MI6, and all along he was working for the Soviet Union. And then last but not least, we have John Cairncross, who's probably going to take up the majority of my time today. So he's a little bit different from the other four. He doesn't come from an upper middle class background at all. In fact, his father was a shop owner, an ironmonger, in a little town called Lesmahago, which is in south central Scotland. It's a mining community, and he's born in 1913, and basically throughout the entire kind of interwar period, when he's growing up, this is a place which has been decimated by the collapse of the coal industry after the end of the First World War. So he comes from a very different world from these individuals. But why do they decide to betray Britain and to spy on their own country? And they do so extremely successfully. There's a stream of thousands of documents coming from these five men, basically from the end point of the 1930s, shortly before the outbreak of the Second World War, through to the collapse of the Ring in 1951. And they've been described as some of the most damaging spies in the history of the 20th century. So why did they decide to do this? So there is an acronym or a mnemonic device which has been come up, I think it's actually by the FBI or the CIA, but actually first appears in some of the literature produced by former Soviet intelligence officers saying, this is what the Americans, this is how they classified it, and we think it's pretty good as well. And that is MICE. And MICE stands for money. So in other words, you betray your country because you want the cash. Someone's going to pay you some money to hand over secrets. So that might be your motivating factor. There's ideology. So in other words, you might be a true believer in the Soviet cause in this instance, and actually you want to see the British state fail, you want to see the American state fail, and you want to see the rise of Soviet communism worldwide. And you're a true believer in the proletarian revolution, and that's what motivates you to do this. So the other option, which is actually misspelled on this one, somewhat unfortunately, is compromise or coercion. So this is the idea, for example, that they might blackmail you. So in terms of the LGBTQ plus issue, which we've talked about a lot this afternoon, so some of the things which happened, particularly when homosexuality was illegal in the United Kingdom, was that the Soviets would find out that this individual, who might be a cipher clerk in the Foreign Office, was gay, and then they would use this to blackmail them into providing information. And last but not least, we have perhaps the most nebulous of these concepts, and that is ego. That you do this because of some psychological need within yourself to either prove yourself to be better than those who are around you, maybe you're also just a thrill seeker, that you want to do this because it gives you some sort of level of excitement to lead this double life. So there's these egotistical reasons which are also part and parcel of this. And this is particularly true, for example, of Kim Philby. So Kim Philby took great delight in betraying those people around him, in proving that he was cleverer than they were. And if you read his autobiography, which was written once he'd actually got to the Soviet Union, so Kim Philby later defects in the 1960s to the Soviet Union, ends up in Moscow. And he writes this book, which basically is really quite unkind to all the people who were around him. And he basically reveled in the fact that he was able to pull the wool over the eyes of all these other clever people, but he was cleverer. So ego plays a large part in this, even if other factors such as money or ideology also play a role in their decision-making processes. So ego, I think, is quite key and is often quite overlooked, certainly within the academic literature, though I couldn't say in the circles of, for example, the intelligence community in Britain or the United States. I don't know what they're thinking, because I've never been a part of that community. However, ego is key, I think, to understanding at least these spies in the 1930s. Okay, so the first that the British public got to know that there had been this really quite calamitous intrusion, I suppose, into the heartland of the British state came in the 1950s. And this was called the Missing Diplomats Affair. Has anyone ever heard of that before? So nobody here has heard of that before. But however, if you'd grown up in the 1950s, in the 1960s, this would have been repeated in the news cycle lots and lots and lots. It was one of the great scandals of the 1950s. And basically what happened was that Donald Maclean and Guy Burgess vanished in 1951. They dropped off the face of the earth. And so the press speculated, what's happened to our missing diplomats? And you can see an example of that from the Daily Mirror here. And as you can see from the headline, what shall our men not deserve? In other words, we don't need to keep an eye on the diplomatic service, we don't need to keep an eye on the Foreign Office in light of this particular disappearance. But this outrage, I suppose, the loss of these men turns into scandal later on in the 1950s, in 1955, when it turns out that Maclean and Burgess have arrived in Moscow. That's where they've arisen. That's where they are. They're in Moscow. They've betrayed Britain and they've been selling secrets all along. So this creates a spy scandal which is then repeated throughout the rest of the 20th century. So by the time we get, for example, to 1963, Kim Philby disappears and this all kicks off again. Then when we get to 1979, Anthony Blunt is revealed in Parliament by Margaret Thatcher as having been a Soviet agent. And then in 1990, the press again reveal that John Cairncross had been the fifth man of this ring of five. So this is a never-ending scandal and it brings down governments almost. And we've all heard, for example, the Profumo affair, which again is linked into this idea of espionage. There's an element of that, and it puts enormous pressure on governments throughout the second half of the 20th century. So let's talk a little bit about why they do these things. So one of the ideas which has emerged is that they all did it because they were communists. Certainly the early literature, the literature which had been published in the 1980s, all says that these are ideological communists who wanted to betray the establishment as part of the Soviet cause. However, I don't think that's entirely correct. So certainly Kim Philby is very much driven by ideology. Certainly he's driven by ideology. So too, for example, is Donald Maclean. These are dyed-in-the-wool communists. But one of the things which the British press did in the 1950s, particularly the tabloids and the red-top newspapers, was to link this with homosexuality. Because Guy Burgess was gay, and there was some suspicion that Donald Maclean might have been bisexual. And because these men were deemed to be in some way aberrant, in some way deviant in terms of their sexuality, then so too might they be deviant in other aspects of their lives. Politically, they were communist. Therefore, that is an aberration. So sexuality, politics, aberration might mean to there being another form of aberration in the fact that they are untrustworthy. That these are the people who are naturally susceptible to giving away information. So the press leaked this throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s, and there's even books, for example, which have been written about these guys, which include, for example, buggery in the title. So this is very much linked into this narrative. But it's not true. But it's not true. If you were to go through all of the spies who've ever been caught and you were to look through what motivated them, sexuality just doesn't come up. It's not the issue at all. Even within the context of the Cambridge Five, Guy Burgess was gay and Anthony Blunt was gay. The other three were not. In fact, Kim Philby famously was a womanizer who had lots of affairs, including later with Donald Maclean's wife when they got to Moscow, when he arrived in Moscow. Similarly, John Cairncross was actually quite homophobic. So Guy Burgess invites him to a cafe, to a party, which he basically describes as being unpleasantly homosexual in terms of its atmosphere. So John Cairncross is also what Christopher Andrew, who's the official historian of MI5, described as being a committed heterosexual. I think you can take from that what that means. But anyway, John Cairncross arrives at Trinity College, Cambridge, in 1934. He's worked really, really hard to get there. He's studied at the University of Glasgow. He spent 2 years at the Sorbonne in Paris. And he's arrived at Trinity College, Cambridge, where he works really, really hard. He does flirt a little bit with the Communist Society there, but isn't really interested so much in that. What he's interested in is anti-fascism. What he's interested in is the rise of Mussolini in the 1920s and then the rise of Hitler in the 1930s. National Socialism in 1933. So that's really kind of what he's worried about. And this is really problematic when we go on throughout the 1930s. Because throughout this time, the British are appeasing Hitler. The British are appeasing Hitler. So if the British aren't willing to stand up and do what's right in combating Nazism and combating fascism, then people like John Cairncross are going to do it for them. And that's a big part, a big motivating factor in why all of the Cambridge Five end up betraying their country. They don't like fascism. Fascism, in some ways, unlike homosexuality, is the real kind of rabbit hole in which you go down trying to combat that, which then leads to connections, for example, the Communist Party of Great Britain, which then leads to connections to the NKVD, which is a forerunner of the infamous KGB. So this is all going on in Cambridge in the 1930s, the reddest generation in the history of the university. Okay, so John Cairncross then ends up going to joining the Foreign Office. He gets a first-class degree from the University of Cambridge in modern languages, and then he ends up in the Foreign Office. And he takes the Foreign Office exam, and he gets the highest mark of his cohort. So he's a very bright man, and he's worked very hard to get there. And this is where the question of ego then comes into my discussion when it comes to John Cairncross. So when he gets there, he thinks, I've made it. I'm part of the establishment now as well. In other words, I've pulled myself up from my bootstraps from Les Behago all the way to the gilded halls of the Foreign Office. And that's the actual picture of one of the rooms in the Foreign Office. So you can kind of see I suppose, the luxuriant kind of nature of that kind of position. But when he gets there, he finds that all of a sudden he's not treated in the way that he believes that he should be treated. So rather than being fairly deferential to him or even treating him as an equal, he's counted as being a kind of a Scottish lower middle class upstart. A lower middle class upstart. So for example, Guy Burgess, who actually wrote a secret report on Cairncross when they were sort of sounding him out whether or not they wanted him to become a spy for them, even describes him saying he speaks with a very strong Scottish accent and you can't call him a gentleman, which in many ways gives us some sort of idea about this. But Burgess is hardly the only snob who's around at this time. The British establishment is a very snobbish institution in the 1930s. So one of the problems that he has is that he has his work described as being slipshod. He's basically seen as being very obsequious, always asking people out for dinner, for lunch and things like that, and nobody really wants to spend any time with him. So there's a very famous civil servant called John Colville, or Jock Colville, and he wrote a very famous set of diaries, and he was the personal private secretary to Winston Churchill and Clement Attlee. And one of the things that he writes about is John Cairncross always inviting him out for lunch, and then John Cairncross eats very, very slowly, and is the most boring man that he's ever met. And he actually says that in his diaries. These are unbelievably boring. So this is the kind of reception that Cairncross finds when he gets to the Foreign Office. And he also gets moved sideways after 2 years. So after all this work getting into the Foreign Office, he's then moved over to a different department, the Treasury. And it's this thing, this process, this idea, I think, of him basically not getting the acceptance that he feels he's deserved, which is the reason why he ends up betraying Britain in the 1930s. So he is appointed to the Foreign Office in 1936, 1937, and within a matter of months, he's decided to betray Britain and to pass information to the Soviet Union. So I think that's a pretty good point to end. These issues are not about sexuality. They're not even necessarily about the ideologies that were floating around in this period. Espionage, betrayal can have other motives that I think have really kind of been overlooked, particularly in terms of popular culture when we talk about these issues. So thank you very much.